Hello everyone, it's History Behind the Warrior, and as always, welcome back to yet another Mortal Kombat video. Now with my time of having covered Mortal Kombat on the channel, in its various different forms, from movies, to comics, to spin-off installments, it's finally lingered in my mind the question of, what and who exactly are the strongest versions of those characters in the Mortal Kombat series? Who is the penultimate version of them across the universe? And how exactly do they stack up to their prior selves? And I personally blame the movie The One for inspiring me to make this video. And to kick things off, I honestly could not think of a better character to tackle than the iconic fan-beloved spectre of the series, the Yellow Ninja Scorpion. Now let's face it, of all the characters that I could have chosen here, Scorpion is a damn near perfect pick to go with, having decades of games and material to work with, allowing for a pretty well-rounded retrospective and analysis of the character's history. That is what will really allow us to compare prior versions of this character to each other, to see who does come out on top here. Now look, when it comes to power scaling, it's kind of a tricky thing to do. Especially when one day you're with your family and then you're an intergalactic spectre of vengeance slaying titans. It gets a little crazy to say the least. Thus, to tidy up this ranking here, I'll only be strictly sticking to the mainline canon versions of the character, as there's simply more material to work with, and a bit more substance to peel off the bone. Plus there's so many instances here, where spin-off games typically only tackle these characters once, so their appearances there are extremely brief. And finally, I will be excluding arcade ladder endings, as 9 times under 10 they don't fall under the main canon. And they do go pretty crazy, so we will be counting our way down to see and understand just who exactly was the strongest version of Scorpion in Mortal Kombat's history. But before we do begin, just a quick reminder that if you like the premise of this format, I would actually be interested in seeing more of it moving forward, please do give this video a thumbs up. It's a small thing, but it's also the best indication of letting me know what you guys would like to see. Plus, if you have any suggestions for future episodes, please do comment down below, as it lets me know what you want to see next. Anywho, let's delve right into things, touching on the weakest version of Scorpion, and well, also his most controversial depiction, Mortal Kombat 1 Scorpion. Now really, this should come as no surprise to anyone. Controversy aside, as the mantle was held by Kuai Liang, this is a particularly dampened version of the character. Whilst the changing of the mantle isn't really the biggest issue in the context of this video, the biggest reason why he's easily by far the weakest depiction of Scorpion is actually due to his powers and that he's mortal. Unlike prior Scorpions of the past, this depiction of the character hasn't actually died to achieve the mantle of Scorpion. In fact, in terms of abilities, this iteration is stripped of his pseudo-immortality and ties to the Netherrealm's darker magics and Hellfire itself, instead utilizing pyromancy and pure skill. And whilst still admittedly impressive in his own right to be that skilled without having to pay the price, we cannot deny the distinguished difference in such power between the living and the undead, which is actually a very important factor moving forward for the rest of this video. As a matter of fact, we really get to see the difference in power here, where the MK1 iteration of Kuai battles a recently transformed Bi-Han, one now donning the noob Cybot mantle that overpowers him in an extremely brief amount of time. And whilst yes, Bi-Han isn't killed in the traditional sense like prior games, we do know that from his corruption onwards, he is effectively an undead wraith. So there's absolutely a gap in power between the living and the dead. Although it is worth mentioning that Bi-Han's power does directly come from a Titan itself. But even with that in mind, there is another problem here, and that's who he defeats. Whilst Kuai's depiction of Scorpion definitely gets some big wins under his belt, you gotta keep in mind, in Liu Kang's new era and vision, all the characters he's kind of defeated are nerfed versions of their prior selves. Shang Tsung is born stripped of his magical properties and teachings, having never learned under Shao, or even participated in the tournament to have become a champion, so those centuries of combat knowledge and skill are gone. Shao is yet another perfect example, because by no longer being the ruler of Outworld, having also been crippled at birth, it means that he was never empowered with the divinity associated with merging the realms. Hell, even Rain is stripped of his godhood here, and Havoc is Dairu, My point is that whilst Kwai is able to get these wins, it comes at the caveat that everyone he beats is arguably the weakest version of themselves. And again, whilst admittedly not terrible in terms of skill, and it's kind of impressive what he's able to achieve without having to die, the power gap between the two universes is what sets him quite far back, thus making him the weakest Scorpion in a mainline game. So this brings us onto the second strongest iteration of the character, and this easily could have been someone in first place, had it not been for a few contributing factors that do hold him back, and that is the Scorpion of the original timeline. Now the Hanzo Hasashi we do have here is effectively the blueprint for the character. So what makes him different from Kwai in that regard? Well, nearly everything. Having been trained to be the most formidable assassin in Japan, Hanzo was already at the top of the mountain, being infamously known throughout the lands as the Scorpion, someone skilled with a kunai and chain. But it doesn't really end there, because then you mix in a bit of, unyielding rage, a sprinkle and mild hint of eternal damnation, and maybe, just maybe a tad bit of vengeance, and you have a formidable juggernaut. That not enough for you? Fine. Make him be an undying spirit who can't effectively fall under normal circumstances? And for the hell of it, give him hellfire magic too. Like, on paper, Hanzo's transformation turns him from a lethal assassin into an unrelenting, inexhaustible hellspawn that is elevated to an unfathomably dangerous level. He is truly a terrifying force, especially if that revenge is directed and channeled at a particular goal. But he isn't without his flaws, because whilst he's near immortal, it doesn't make him invincible, and this overconfidence does nearly get him killed. I'll touch on that a little bit later on. Now, in terms of wins and losses, Scorpion does have some very solid accolades under him, having defeated 2 Sub-Zeros and a sort of win over Quan Chi. But it's during the 3D era where things get a little bit sketchy with the character, as the focus strays away from him with a newer generation of fighters being interwoven. But it's also during this time period where he does reach the peak of his power in this timeline, because after suffering a loss at the hands of Dramin and Moloch, having been ambushed and tossed into a Soulnado, one of the very few things that can permanently kill a Spectre, separating their spirit from their body, it's here where he would be plucked from it and turned into the champion of the Elder Gods. A very distinguished mantle, but with an inherent narrative crutch to it, being that very little goes to show just how powerful or significant this mantle means. What I'm saying is that with the story having a strong narrative focus on Shigenko, the protagonist, Scorpion isn't just shoved into that of a supporting role, but directly put as an antagonist to him, one that expectedly has the player beat him. And whilst normally this wouldn't actually seem like a bad thing, this is the one and only time he fights someone under the mantle, making it kind of impossible to gauge just how much of an impact this made on him outside of being a fancy title. Sure, it happens near the end of the game where Shigenko is teetering like the peak of his power, but with the final 2 encounters of the Conquest mode having been Scorpion and Onaga, it's impossible to know what the power gap is between those two, as the Spectre is beaten in one-on-one combat, whereas the Dragon King is canonically defeated by Shigenko being used as a vessel for all of the fighter's powers in one singular punch. There's no way to gauge just how powerful he is. So the difference in power between both fights is not only immense, but has it so we just can't scale it appropriately. Plus, I know we do have that arcade ladder ending, but does mention he gained a power boost. But as I said, I'm 1, not including arcade ladder endings, and 2, I don't think this is an accurate way to gauge how strong the character is, as nearly all character endings effectively result in the Dragon King slain. Plus, this power boost is only temporary, effectively being removed during the events of Armageddon, but it's kind of implied he may have been stripped of his immortality, being one of the many fallen during Armageddon. Now, in my opinion, had the Champion of the Elder Gods direction been expanded upon, or hell, even tackled in the Reboot Trilogy, this may have given us some more information and a better perspective of just what this does to someone, and easily could have shifted him to the #1 spot. But with such a direction having never been taken, I simply can't scale him up appropriately beyond what we know, as honestly, it feels more like a title than anything actually significant here. It's the somewhat narrative constrictions and issues of this time period that does hold him back. In my mind, the interpretation of this title is only as powerful as a player believes it to be. Thus, we can't hold it up on too high of a pedestal. However, I do want to say in states that I feel like the original Scorpion could walk, so his reboot iteration could run. Because at our #1 spot, we do of course have the Reboot trilogy of the character, where there is a narrative switch of style from a traditional arcade layout format to that of a more cinematic film focused direction, one that greatly benefits a large overall percentage of the cast, as we do get more fights and more character development as a whole. So how exactly does this benefit Hanzo Hasashi? Well, it does so in a number of different ways. You see, from a power standpoint, he is more or less able to take away all the narrative prose of his original counterhalf. However, the biggest change here is his switch from a spectre to that of his normal form, which is both a good and a bad thing here, from a power and story standpoint. Because what I mean is that in terms of storylines, it's actually kind of awesome that Hanzo was able to break the shackles of Quan Chi, being restored to the man he once was. But by doing so and no longer being a spectre, it also rids him of his immortality, so he loses the benefit of being able to come back from the dead. Yet even so, he actually gains the benefit of retaining some of his former Spectre abilities. Which of course does raise the question of, does this necessarily make him stronger than his younger self? Well, yes and no. Because with death now a prevalent factor, I believe it's actually allowed Hanzo to refine and hone his skills better. And we do see this when he confronts his younger self, beating him in combat. And in terms of notable victories and defeats, Scorpion has a lot under his belt in terms of accolades, being capable of defeating the likes of Sector and Cyrax, both pre and post cyberization. He's able to defeat Bihan twice, in both his Sub-Zero and Noob Saibot form, but arguably his biggest accolade to date is his win over Raiden, which is actually why he's at the #1 spot here. In terms of canon and lore, whilst the two are technically 1-for-1, there are certain factors in play that make his most recent victory very important. Because back in Mortal Kombat 9, their first altercation happens in the Netherrealm, a place where specters gain a notable power boost, and gods are greatly weakened. Yet even with the home field advantage, Scorpion does lose that fight. Whereas in 11, those roles are actually flipped and reversed, with Raiden on the mortal plane and Scorpion fighting him, defeating the Thunder God and even holding back as he wishes to join his side. And defeating a god, let alone Raiden, is no easy feat, being one of the more protected characters in the mythos. But it is kind of inconsistent with this younger version of him, as just prior to this, he did of course lose to his older self and then earlier the Shaolin monks. But narratively, you could say that this somewhat passing of the torch of Hanzo's legacy could have been the needed turning point for that iteration of the character. But I also feel like that's quite a noticeable power boost. That's very ambitious for him to beat the likes of a god and Kuai Liang. It's why I said that the original timeline version and reboot version are very interchangeable, and a lot of this can simply be chalked up to how plot armor and progression takes priority. But I feel like the reboot iteration gains more, simply from the narrative change of direction, and allowing him to juggle and battle a variety of different characters. There's simply more to show, which is what I believe gives him that edge over his prior self. But it's not by too much in my opinion. So, with that said and everything covered here, that has been it for my coverage, breakdown and analysis of the strongest Scorpion in Mortal Kombat's history, from the arcade era of the past to that of the current new era. And I gotta say, this was actually quite pleasantly fun to put together. Whilst I'm not one to really talk or care much about power scaling, I felt like this was a surprisingly fun deep dive that allowed us to kind of understand just how different each version of the character is. Thus, with my analysis out the way, what are your thoughts on this list here? Do you agree? Do you not? What has been your personal favourite take on the character? Please do comment down below, as I'd love to hear what you have to say. And also, who who do you think I should cover next? But until the next one everyone, please take care.